Yeah. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jonathan Simpson, Associate at ANL Goodbody with Gareth. Yeah, there's been quite a few questions coming through this morning as the webinar has marched on, and we also had some questions through in advance. So what we're going to do is just run through as many of these as we can in the time remaining to us, and some of it hopefully will have been covered during the presentation as well. So the first question that we have, it's quite specific, industry specific. It's an employer here who whose employees are defined as key workers at the front line of dealing with individuals who have COVID-19. Although they'll be using appropriate PPE, some staff feel vulnerable due to their personal circumstances, so they wish to be considered for the job retention scheme. Generally they may have partners with underlying health conditions. So to protect these staff members, can we use the scheme to furlough such key workers? There's quite a few pieces to this one. It's obviously very specific with key workers, possibly in the healthcare sector by the sounds of it. So questions for the employer there are exactly why its staff are feeling vulnerable due to personal circumstances. Is it their own medical concerns, or is it because they wish to shield family members who are potentially shielding? Or are they just reluctant to work just due to the virus in general? In terms of the shielding point, Gareth touched on this in his presentation in terms of, is there an NHS letter in place that provides for that this person, that people must shield for 12 weeks? In those circumstances, the person can be furloughed. If it's an individual who just wishes to stay off because of their partner, there is some guidance in relation to caring, but it's only where it's in line with government guidance, so it's not necessarily a requirement that you furlough them in those circumstances. So there are a number of aspects that need to be considered, and also needs to be careful about setting a precedent in terms of what you do in relation to certain employees. Second question is in relation to calculation of wages for weekly paid employees working variable hours. The guidance states that it is the higher of their monthly wages for the month in the previous tax year, or an average of their wages for the 2019-2020 tax year. So this employer operates weekly wages and have therefore calculated the rates based on week 51 or 52, I think, for 2018-19 tax year. So instead of looking at the previous month's wages, they've just looked at the last week's wage effectively in the month from the last year, or weeks 1 to 51 of the most recent tax year. Is this correct, and will HMRC accept this basis? Well, it's difficult to know at this stage. HMRC guidance is to come out shortly in relation to how the portal will operate more specifically, and the portal itself opening hopefully around the 20th of April. When the guidance is finalised by HMRC, some of those questions will hopefully be answered in more detail, but effectively based on the government guidance, the average for the year should be fairly straightforward in terms of looking at figures on a P60. But in terms of looking at the last week's pay of the same month in 2019 instead of the full month, that wouldn't be in line with what's set out in the guidance to date. And another option might be to multiply that by the earnings and divide it to try and get a monthly figure, and then divide that back down into weeks. But that's it's going to probably require a bit more clarification by HMRC. So then, with the government guidance on job retention scheme continually being updated and changing, please can you advise on how the amount of furlough pay should be calculated for employees on a weekly payroll? Normal payroll elements would consist of basic pay, overtime hours, but only if overtime has actually been worked. And there's night shift premiums here and allowance for working on Sunday. So a lot of this is going to be very specific to the contract with the employee. It'll be difficult to know exactly in those circumstances how the approach should be made. The government guidance talks about overtime in terms of past overtime effectively worked prior to furlough. So the indications would be in terms of what you can claim. It's going to be limited to an extent, and a conservative approach should probably be taken to what you're going to pay during furlough, subject to guidance changing, and bearing in mind that there may be limitations on what you can ultimately recover back through from HMRC. Gareth, have you anything to add on that point?
No. I think it's a difficult question for everybody in working out what we should do for variable pay, etc. But the answer has to be at this stage to look at the guidance such as it is, look back at the equivalent period previously, average that out, and make the application. Make the application on behalf of the employee. If HMRC reject it, there will probably be some kind of appeal mechanism, and we can clarify. And if they accept it, fine, off we go. But the one thing employers must not do in this situation is overpromise what they understand the portal will do to employees and then underdeliver, because that's just going to be a morale hit, which is arguably going to be even more significant to deal with in due course than the simple financial hit.
Yeah. Okay, so next question. As a new self-employed business owner with less than a year behind me, is there any support that I can avail of? Gareth ran through some brief points on the self-employment income support scheme. So yeah, even if you've less than a year behind you, if you've submitted an income tax self-assessment tax return for the 2018-19 year, then you'll still be eligible, and we'll just base any calculations on what you have returned. So they'll only use the years that you've actually filed a self-assessment tax return. There is other bits and pieces that the government have introduced to try and support people in that situation, including deferral of self-assessment tax income payments that are due in July, and VAT payments as well. There's universal credits available depending on the person's actual circumstances and income as it goes forward, and then there may be in certain circumstances eligibility for grants for businesses that pay low or no business rates, and then also there's a business interruption loan scheme which can be looked at if necessary. There's a series of questions here, including some regarding the holidays taken during furlough. These are clearly a very vexed issue at the minute. So can employees take holiday during furlough, and if so, what percentage of pay? As Gareth covered that off fairly thoroughly in the presentation. Yes, the guidance is unclear at the minute. Some of the commentary from the likes of ACAS, HMRC is that yes, you can take holiday during furlough, but it should be paid at 100%. So we're likely to find out some more additional information on that shortly through government updates. What evidence do employers need to demonstrate that their operations are severely affected by COVID-19 before being able to take advantage of the job retention scheme? It's a very important question for employers, one that's coming through from a lot of the questions today. It's not a means tested scheme. It is distinct from the approach in the Republic of Ireland, where they have you have to be able to demonstrate this 25% downturn. We don't have to do that here. The guidance says that it is though for those who cannot maintain their current workforce because their operations have been severely affected. It does suggest that it's the scheme should be used where redundancies are being considered, or related measures such as temporary layoff would have to be affected. But the guidance does state that all employers are eligible to claim under the scheme, and the government recognises that different businesses will face different impacts from coronavirus. So there's no set assessment on how severe the impact is for business, but we'd recommend that businesses, before they place employees in furlough and take steps to do that they do thoroughly document their rationale and their thought process around why they're doing this and why they feel they need to do this. And be cautious in that approach, because as the HMRC has said, they will go back and they will look at businesses' use of this scheme in the future, and we have no idea how aggressive that process could be. Do employees continue to accrue statutory holidays during furlough? Yes. If an employee was made redundant after the 28th of February 2020 and then redeployed and then furloughed, can they be obliged to repay notice and redundancy payments as a condition of re-employment? It's an interesting question. There may be mechanisms to offset against salary, perhaps. It might be difficult to manage. Gareth, have you any views on that?
Yeah, that's an extremely difficult one. It touches on the point again about why would an employee or rehire someone in this situation because of the 28th of February PAYE date, and that's exactly one of the issues that presents. What do you do about packages that were paid to an individual when they left your employment? What if there was a compromise agreement? What if there was an enhanced payment? Would you bring them back in those circumstances? The answer is probably no. But that's one where you would need to take effectively bespoke legal advice in that and understand exactly what your contractual position is and what the business rationale might be for it. The other piece to that then is you need to be exceptionally careful as well. If you were to bring some individuals back for and rehire and not others, then you run the underlying employment question of, well, why? Is it because I have a protected characteristic? Is this a form of discrimination? So in the last two questions, I think Johnny's point, the underlying piece is the business will still have to illustrate its rationale, record that, because it may be presented A, to HMRC to justify certain decisions, or B, in a negative scenario in an industrial tribunal in a year's time as to why you made the decisions you did in and around furlough and selection of staff. So don't want to be too negative about that, but it is an unfortunate reality. There will be certain employees out there who will litigate whatever we do. So you have to have your written business rationale retained. And in a sense, that's no surprise. HMRC are still saying now that all employers who furlough or who engage in furlough comms with staff should retain records of those communications for a period of up to 5 years. And that's illustrative as well, that HMRC probably are giving themselves up to a 5-year period to retrospectively review and assess this, decisions taken by employers, elections made by employers, rates of pay, categories, etc., and allowing themselves that time, if needs be, to investigate and recoup. And that's just a reminder, of course, about some of the teeth to this.
Mm-hmm. So we've just got a few minutes left to run through some more questions. One that's come through today, and it was also in advance of today, we had a similar question. Can we pay our staff a reduced retainer or potentially even defer salary until the furlough portal is live, or is it required that we pay our staff 80% their normal wage? So I think this is getting at, to what extent can we hold back on salary until the portal comes up and we can get the grant, and what's going to happen if we try to make a claim through the portal in those circumstances. I mean, based on some of the mechanisms under the scheme in relation to taking back people who've been made redundant and things like that, it does seem that it's likely that you can defer salary payments or reduce them. This is a contractual agreement between you and the employee, as opposed to anything in relation to what the grant is designed to cover. So unless HMRC guidance comes out to contradict that, that would seem to be something that a step that can be taken.
Thanks, Johnny. Look, I think I know we're pretty much close to being out of time. I know Rodney has said that we would maybe take an extra 5 minutes or so at the end of this for Q&A. We are clearly not going to get through all the Q&A that have been raised, but we will be doing another seminar with INI, both on updates and dealing with other frequently asked questions, I suppose. So if there are any questions arising out of today's presentation or those which we didn't get round to, we will answer them. And I think, bearing in mind, I as a partner in a law firm with 130 employees in Belfast, we're approaching these and answering these not just as an employment advisor, but also as an employer that's dealing with exactly the same issues that everybody listening to this is dealing with as well. So very much this is a very fluid time. There will be additional government guidance, and we are committed to working with INI to answer all the questions that you've got. I think on that note, Rodney, it's probably best to bring you back in just to wrap up.
Okay, Gareth and Jonathan, that's us wrapping up this webinar today. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time for presenting. Everyone, we've got through as many of your questions as we could, and we hope you found this session to be useful. If we weren't able to get to your questions today, we continue to update our business advice website, nibusinessinfo.co.uk, with the latest government guidance, advice and FAQs. And I would encourage you, if you want to receive the latest news, please sign up for their email newsletter on the nibusinessinfo.co.uk website. We are also holding another webinar tomorrow at 11 AM entitled Practical Measures to Manage a Crisis, and you can register for that on the events section of investni.com. And as Gareth said, we plan to hold another session with him and Jonathan from NL Goodbody in the next couple of weeks to update on the latest guidance for the job retention scheme as this unfolds. If you'd like to be notified of that, then please ensure you sign up for the Invest Northern Ireland 2-minute update email newsletter on the investni.com website, or you can keep an eye on the events section of our website, investni.com/events. I would like to thank everybody for attending today. I hope you found this of use, and we will be in touch again shortly. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gareth, and thank you, Jonathan.